Welcome to Fraction's next peer-to-peer webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by our presenter today, Mike Campbell. Mike will take us through his deck and do introduction himself very soon, but just to say a few opening words to Phraktion very briefly. We have a very bold ambition, as I'm sure you all know, about revolutionising how work gets done in pharma. Really a new model accessing how we get hold of real expertise and moving beyond the traditional consultancy and agency models. We're doing that by providing fractional top-tier expertise, I think, as you can see on the call today, and also in Mike's presentation, really an exemplar there of the fractional expertise we are able to provide. And I think on the call today, Jason has been using our expertise readily as well, so he can vouch for that. So welcome, Jason, to today's call. Long time no see, of course. And we're delivering a fractional expertise by actually a very well in-connected global network of over 1,000 pharma experts now, so a very truly impressive growth curve for Phraktion in a relatively short space of time. So without any further ado, over to the next slide. Well, I'll go to the next slide, sorry, Mike, to introduce your presentation. Just to say something about Mike. I've enjoyed getting to know Mike over the last few weeks. Clearly an expert in the commercial function across many different pharma companies and across therapy areas. What I've also enjoyed about Mike is getting to know his sporting expertise and prowess, and seems to know something about something called soccer, which point I sort of blanked over and knew nothing about. I think maybe something to do with football. But there we go. But on that old joke, Mike, over to you.
Nigel is referencing the fact that I retired from American soccer, European football just a couple years ago as a result of COVID. So COVID will ever be on my blacklist, but too many people recovered, and the people who recovered over COVID were better than me. So when the team was picked for the next season, I got the boot. So that's the story Nigel is referring to with my soccer career, and it lasted much longer than I thought it would. So I was happy about that. Nigel, if you want to advance the slides. When should commercials start doing pre-commercial activities to make sure that there's a successful launch? Because I think everyone knows that nowadays, especially if a product doesn't get off to a good, successful launch, the likelihood of it ever recouping and getting back to the original forecasts and projections are lost. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the second of those two. I do reference the other piece of this during it, and to the comment earlier that if we work both of them into this presentation, we'd be here for about 3 hours. So again, once we get into Q&A, both from my perspective, both areas are fair game and both are very interesting. Next slide, please. For those of you who don't know me, just a quick additional introduction. I'm not the New Zealand golfer who won the US Open, and the US Open just started a few hours ago. But I have 20 plus years of marketing US and global experience, both in lines and new products, have worked in many, many different therapeutic areas, and have worked across large, medium, and small companies. And, I think the environment today lends itself very much to what the Phraktion team is trying to do. I mean, there's a lot of changes going on. Big pharma, medium-sized pharma just don't have the resources to do some of the things they wanted to as they cut, and it leaves open the door individuals within the Phraktion organization to step in and really help out and provide value. We can talk about that a little bit more as we go, but I think some of what I'm going to talk about with the early stages of development and progressing towards launch, again, really lends itself to the Phraktion capabilities, because pharma companies aren't investing as much as they'd like to. I personally think that from a pre-approval process, commercial doesn't spend enough money, and it's getting harder and harder, more and more expensive. So again, it opens the door for individuals within the Phraktion organization to step in and fill the void and help to accelerate things when a lot of products are being decelerated, which is long-term very harmful to them. Next slide, please, Nigel. So just something for people to ponder while we're going through this. Should it be early? Should it be late? Should it be in the middle of the development process or should it be never? I know there's a lot of different thoughts on that. And again, from my perspective, there's two parts to it. It's inputting into what a product will look like once it hits the market and commercial giving input based on market research and advisory boards, et cetera, on what's needed to differentiate a product once it hits the market. And then also nowadays, especially the timing. And if you don't prime the pump well enough pre-launch, are you going to have a successful launch? And then will you ever recoup the investment you spent both commercially pre-launch and also in a larger piece of the pie from an R&D perspective? Because everyone knows that the R&D investment upfront is much, much larger than the commercial, even though the commercial is large. Next slide, please. Just a couple comments on the evolving pre-launch landscape. And just to step back for 1 second. So I'm going to share some information I was able to dig up, and I'm also going to share information based on a number of products that I've worked on or seen being worked on during my career. But 70% of products miss their launch expectations. And this is a fairly current piece of work, so it's not going back to the 1970s. It's based on things that have been happening in the 20s. And once they miss their mark, they never catch up. 80% of products that launch on target tend to beat expectations going forward. So that launch window is so critical to the long-term success or failure of an asset. Next slide, please. So everyone knows new product launches are pivotal for companies to maintain growth and keep going. About over the last 15 years, close to half of the products that have launched have underperformed by more than 20%. Now, there's some examples where assets were supposed to be multi-billion-dollar products, and 3, 4, 5 years post-launch, they're in the $50 to $125 million range and never going to come anywhere close to that $2 billion peak year sales. So again, just highlighting some real world data in terms of what's happening in the world, and raises the question about are expectations being created based on what has happened historically versus this new changing world. And larger companies seem to be a little bit more successful, maybe because they have deeper pockets and are able to do a little bit more pre-approval than smaller companies that are scrambling just to pay for the R&D expenses versus having anything left over to do some pre-approval commercialization efforts. But even those are even large pharma's not doing all that well in the whole scheme of things. Next slide, please. So an extra variable in this whole launch mix, and I was able to find some very interesting data on this, is COVID. And if you look at launches pre and post COVID, a very large number of post-COVID launches are not being successful. And that doesn't take into play completely the main topic here, which is what to do pre-approval. But I thought it was extremely interesting information. It maybe highlights the fact that more work has to be done pre-approval than not, because one of the dynamics that's come up and one of the key parts to a successful launch is awareness getting and ramping up to launch. And as a result of COVID in a number of therapeutic areas, physicians are not able to get as comfortable as they have historically with the product. So they're less likely to use it quickly after it's approved and launched. And number two, a dynamic that I think is really, really interesting, and I've seen a decent amount of data on it, is that a physician, even if they are comfortable with it, given the change in market dynamics where many physicians are now working from home versus going into the office, they are very hesitant to prescribe for a new patient a new product when they're communicating with the patient for the first time or first couple times over Zoom. So As much as individuals like doing this remote work, and physicians I know like it as well, it has actually had a negative effect on product uptake, which to me screams that if we have this extra dynamic slowing uptake down, something has to be done pre-approval to offset that. Otherwise, the trajectory of launches is never going to be close to what it used to be. This is illustrative, but it's consistent with a lot of different launches out there. And if you look on the left-hand side, the lower left, uh, you lay the foundation for commercial success in investing in some of these pre-approval commercial activities. And to the right-hand side, the upside of all the forecasts we put together is what you want to achieve. And some of the dynamics I just spoke about are pushing all launches down into the lower part of that, which says, okay, more investment has to be done pre-approval, but then you get into the dynamic of where's the money coming from, and if there's obviously a risk with bringing products to market, and what's the willingness to spend more commercially up front to achieve the forecast that we have on paper, or the only alternative is to say, okay, we're going to continue to invest the way we did, knowing that base case forecasts aren't really achievable, and it's much more likely that a lower uh, case forecast is going to be the most realistic achievable end because of the dynamics I've just discussed. So it does make you think, and people at very high levels within organizations are going to have to start thinking through that and determining, how do you approach this? Because the whole market dynamic, from my perspective, has changed, and it's getting harder and harder not only to achieve upside forecasts once you launch, but even uh, the mid-range forecasts that have always been kind of the standard from a commercial perspective. Next slide, please. Just putting this in here, again, from a thinking perspective, we don't have to go all the way back to drug discovery, but the time frame we're talking about here is a 7 to 9 range, and there's always, from my perspective, been a hesitancy to go back anywhere beyond the yellow bar into the uh, phase one and even early phase two and invest because of the uncertainty and the risk. But I think to get any kind of consistent results in terms of market uptake once a product launches, the commercial investment is going to have to push back further and further, with the risk being taken into consideration. Something that, if anybody has thoughts on it later on during the discussion, I'm not sure how AI can be used to kind of help offset some of the risk being done, but I've heard a couple individuals over the last couple weeks talking about it. I'm not sure that I'm bought into it, but it does seem like a potential viable option in terms of finding some increased safety within investing based on the likelihood of a product success. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide at all, but just again, from a most current numbers of spend from bringing a product from early stage all the way through, you're talking about on average 2.6 billion, and ranging from 900 million to 2.6, and that includes the preclinical work, clinical trials, etc. So again, just keep in mind that companies are expending a tremendous amount of funds and having to determine whether they even have the purses to spend money on commercial. Again, my argument is yes, they need to. Otherwise, this initial expenditure is going to be even riskier than it's been in the past because of the slower uptake on launches. So just a couple things from my own personal work experience that I wanted to share. Some of the most challenging aspects of having a very small commercial budget early on as a product is progressing towards launches. things that have to be done and it sometimes gets skimped on. TPP market research, and again, this would be something to share very much with uh, an R&D team. And so if commercial leadership allows uh, a brand team leader to do TPP market research late in the development process, it's not going to really help because once um, certain aspects of the clinical work is done, there'll be a disconnect and we'll see, okay, this is what's being done clinically and the TPP that's going to be commercially viable is very different. So not a good scenario, similar with the payer world, especially now where um, payers are asking for more and more data. This work has traditionally been done very late in the game, and I've even seen within the last couple of years people saying, "Well, we did that payer work, 12 months ago, so we're not going to redo it till after launch," which to me is a big mistake because um, the payer world's changing quickly. Obviously, in the Healthcare Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and some changes in individual markets in Europe have made it even more challenging to price assets high and to have protection from exclusivity. So this work needs to be done on a more regular basis from my perspective and not a less frequent. Otherwise, again, we'll get to the launch stage without a real clear picture of what's going to happen once the door opens up. And from a US perspective, this is another aspect from the payer world where it's just slowing down uptake because pricing isn't confirmed, products aren't on formulary, and then it just lags behind. And I think from a forecasting perspective and a finance perspective, at least I'll speak more to the US because I'm a few years removed from Europe. These things are hindering accurate projections, if you will. Um, then some other things that are taking much longer than they used to. There are challenging activities going on in the naming process. Names are so important to pharmaceutical products and any brand. Recently, I ran into a challenge where the FDA didn't decline a proposed name or its follow-on, but all three times they said another company has submitted a name very similar to your name. So you have to negotiate with that company, but we're not going to tell you who that company is.
Huh.
And we'll be the go-between. So if both parties are willing to let us be the go-between, the FDA would help negotiate that. In none of the cases did that scenario pan out, and we had to go to a fourth option. So I saw some data recently where the naming process can take up to 3 years realistically. And then when you are looking for a name that's consistent across the US and the EU and other markets, it's even longer. So these are things that used to not be quick, but I just think exponentially the time frame has exploded where it can have a tremendous negative impact on a brand's success. And I've even heard stories about companies launching assets with generic names only because they didn't want to wait, which I can't imagine that those products are not even brands anymore if they don't have a brand name did very well. So just really, really challenging environment from my perspective to uh, get commercial things moving forward. And then, the market shaping piece, which, there's always been a hesitancy to do market shaping where you could be helping out competitors, but without the old saying of, rising water raises all boats, it just creates an environment where uptake is really, really tough. If you've got a unique therapeutic property, there is potential to really differentiate. And I know there are regulatory uh, um, considerations, if you will, that have to be worked through with the regulatory departments, but they can be done, and it's a way to again differentiate earlier than later, and hopefully not delay too much of an uptake once a product launches. Next slide, please. So just to highlight what, from a commercial perspective, we're looking for. Um, to be a successful product: efficacy, safety, convenience, and differentiation. And the efficacy, the safety, a lot of that comes through just from the clinical trial work, which again hopefully has some commercial contribution. But the convenience and the overall product differentiation is something that can take significant time. And as therapeutic areas become more and more crowded, I think these efforts have to be started earlier and earlier, regardless of the cost, uh, or find a more efficient way of doing it. And I'm looking at Paul and Nigel in the screen as I do that. Again, they're expensive the way they are now. Are there options in terms of doing some of these things less expensively but getting good results? Yes. And then just a few things in terms of what is commercial looking for ahead of time and pre-launch. Again, partnering with clinical on TPPs and target product claims. Patient journey, customer journeys have become much more important, uh, at least in the therapeutic areas I've worked in over the last 5 years or so. Better understanding the marketplace. And that seems pretty straightforward, but markets are changing so quickly that, again, you can't just say, well, we did this work 12 months ago. It can wait till after the product's approved. And then the payer world just keeps changing faster and faster. And, you know, availability on formulary, what kind of pricing can we have? If you make the wrong decision now, especially in markets like in the United States with the Healthcare Inflation Reduction Act, you're locked into a price where you're paying penalties for the next 10 years. So again, the approach to pre-approval has become much, much more complicated from a commercial perspective. And from my perspective, the only way to really work your way out of it is to spend more wisely and to have more data to make better informed decisions on how to manage the commercial launch. So can anything be changed? I'm going to say that on the left-hand side of this slide, where we've got uh, the drug development process, not that much. I mean, I know R&D folks have been trying for years to come up with creative ways to design trials, to accelerate trials. I'm going to say that the right-hand side, the roadmap to commercial launch success, and this talks about the historic approach and the timelines, where a lot of companies focus on 24 months to launch, needs to shift to the left. And I don't know all the details about all the work, and it will definitely differ by therapeutic area and how crowded a market is. But there has to be that shift. Otherwise, not to beat a dead horse, but launches will just not be successful. So what's the right time for commercial involvement? And is there the right time? Just I think you know my opinion on this based on what I've been saying, but other things to be considered is IP runway, timing of future competitors, uh, the probability of success, which uh, can get clouded based on a number of different factors around clinical trials, and then the work that needs to be done on commercial messaging and promotions uh, early on to, again, prime the pump so that when launch comes, things can happen quickly. Next slide, please. Um, a few other thoughts to add to that is the brand naming process. I already touched on that and some of the complications around that. Finding patients for clinical trials. I know that that tends to slide into the clinical R&D bucket, but it can have significant impact on the timing of getting a product approved, which obviously has significant impact on business cases and MPVs. As markets become more and more competitive, there are fewer patients that are out there, and I've seen it several times in the last few years where you had three or four companies pursuing very similar assets, going after the same patient populations, and the company I was closest to, they had all their timelines shot to pieces because they couldn't get the patients and none of the clinical timelines were met. So very challenging, something I think we don't think enough about. And I've heard some key opinion leaders chime in and say that at certain periods of time they could look out and say, okay, there's plenty of time to get the appropriate patients. But if you miss that window, you're going to have a whole bunch of companies at the same time competing for the same patients for trials. And then similar, generating non-label data. It's something that's becoming more and more important to find differentiation and to generate data that's meaningful, whether it's in the label or done in parallel to the label, is becoming more and more important, and that's taking time. It's something that has to be thought through in terms of the implications of trying to get it in a label versus not. And so more time, more money. So more complexity to getting a product to launch. Next slide, please. So I think I've pretty much covered everything here. So I'm not going to beat a dead horse and go through this, but just when the slides go out, it's just, again, just some extra things that talk to some of the things that have to be done from a pre-approval process commercially. So you've got the market research, which has to be deeper. Market access becomes more and more important, and building the brand has to be done in a slightly different way to ensure differentiation at launch. Nigel, next slide, please. This one just is up here, not to read all the little bullets, but it's to talk about all the different market research activities that now need to be done, and there's probably some more listed on here. And it's just hard to do all of these things if you look at the upper left, in a 16 to 24 months prior to approval, and execute on it and have it in promotional material, etc. So my argument is that this is kind of a slightly outdated timeline in terms of how things are done, and more has to be done earlier. We've talked about the importance of pre-approval marketing, and I think that some real work has to be done here, working internally and with regulatory colleagues and with regulatory authorities to be able to try to differentiate and get data out on mechanisms of action. There's more and more variation coming out. And right now, the penalty, I think everybody knows, is that, it's you get slapped with the pre-approval marketing. But if you have a mechanism that's truly different, that's going to take time for physicians to get comfortable with and prescribers, there has to be some path forward to be able to allow some information, not necessarily through a brand team, but through medical affairs or some kind of more clinically focused group within organizations, so that that comfort level exists at the time of launch. You can't launch a complex mechanism asset at launch and be starting from scratch or near scratch to educate users, because by the time they're comfortable with it, it'll be too late, both commercially but also realistically, clinically, to get the most value out of an asset like that. Regulatory considerations I talked about a little bit, and data and information exchange. In the US, a couple of years ago, the pre-approval information exchange came through, and I've seen it work successfully in terms of getting some really important information to payers. But I think this avenue gets more and more complicated as well. And as we go forward, payers will want more information, and it'll be just more time consuming and costly to generate the data that they need. So again, talking to, is enough being spent by commercial before approval? If this piece of this slide gets more and more expensive, again, the answer is going to be no. Next slide, please. And so again, the goal here is to be able to, from my perspective, invest more commercially before launch so that we can achieve those upside forecasts that over the most recent years has been unachievable for very few assets. Obviously, there are some of these biologics being approved that are doing a lot of direct-to-consumer advertising, and in the US at least, that are going through the roof. But overall, when you look at the numbers, more assets failed and overachieve when it comes to launch forecasts. So I've got one more slide to go, and I just want to again highlight that 70% of products miss launch expectations. And from my perspective, a big part of that is that the commercial pharmaceutical world that existed for the longest time has changed. The split between spend of R&D and commercial is before approval has more or less remained, and there's a need to, if not spend more, to generate more pre-approval in order to ensure that launch acceleration is consistent with what expectations are. So with that, I think our next slide comes from you, Nigel. It was basically the discussion slide. So I guess we open it up to discussion. So again, everything I've shared is based on my experience, some data I found, and would love to hear other people discuss and debate, as Paul said at the beginning, because it is a hot and ever constant topic.
Well, thank you, Mike. I've just come off stop share, so hopefully we can see.
There's a couple of questions in chat, two are from me, one's from Lorna. So the first question from Lorna is the obvious twin set. Can you comment more on the role of medical affairs, Mike, in terms of that early phase involvement?
Sure. I mean, and every company is a little bit different. I've seen medical affairs that sits closer to R&D and clinical versus commercial, but especially to my points about communicating about challenging and complex mechanism of actions and unique molecules coming out. I would say as of today, medical affairs is the best way to get that information out. What I think this stumbling block in a lot of companies is, again, because it's not product specific enough for some companies. So they would say, well, we're not going to allow medical affairs to put too much more time and effort into it, to prime the pumps, if you will. But as if you held a gun to my head today and said, well, what's the best way to do it? Probably medical affairs, because they have the most flexibility in terms of communications with physicians and HCPs to communicate nuances and differences that a commercial team isn't at liberty to communicate.
I would agree, Mike. And it's interesting because I work closely with a lady called Helen Kane, who's a very famous expert on CAMs and also MSLs. So from the MSL strategy, she does an annual survey of when does medical affairs get involved in early phase launch. And every year, the results are getting earlier and earlier and earlier. So MSLs are getting involved in phase 1 and in phase 2 because they're having conversations with KOLs and physicians. They're starting to seed education about conceptual disease management.
Right.
And not getting near selling, but they are sort of, to your point you made earlier, helping physicians see that the future is changing and educating around sort of broad therapeutic change rather than getting caught up in promoting products. So I think the earlier the better. I think it's the same conclusion, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah,
No, absolutely.
I should add, Mike, that both Paul and Jason on the call were thought leaders in this field, actually, because over 2 decades ago, they saw the need to get medical science liaison in the field pre-launch, talking about a specialist product in the UK. So they were leaders there, Paul.
Structural question. That is what is mine, Mike. So sorry, I'm jumping in.
No, that's fine.
What structure or key commercial positions, whether it's perm or whether it's fractional, do you suggest in those really early years? Let's say -5 to -3, so way ahead of where pharma is now. What type of individuals or roles would you see being right for commercial at -5, -3, for that sort of time frame?
I'm not sure if it's so much of a role per se, but the information commercial needs early
Mm.
um, is being able to interact early with key opinion leaders, just like medical affairs, so that they're hearing what they need to hear. And if commercials talking early to key opinion leaders, it's a very different view of the marketplace than if they're just doing market research. So you have to kind of marry the two because obviously key opinion leaders are in a different spot. But that early on, they're the ones who can kind of see where, from a scientific perspective, the market's going to. So I think commercial needs to be uh, involved with them. I think now, with the market access and payer world, really, to me, it seems like ramping up and taking
Yeah.
hold. Commercial needs to be hearing that too, because commercial then needs to come back and be in a position to sit with clinical colleagues and say, if we don't have this kind of data, we're going to be sunk.
Yeah.
It'll take us, we can't on launch day say, oh, we need this now and we're going to get it in 2 years. And in the past, sometimes that has worked, sometimes not. But I think it really is necessary now, and it's necessary to determine whether it has to be in the label or whether just generating some of that data, um, excuse me, which is less risky, obviously, will suffice to do it. But again, those two pieces, I think, the earlier the better, because otherwise, again, you're going to need it eventually, given everything that's
Yeah.
happened and changing. And if you wait too long, you're going to be sitting there saying, well, we have a really good product.
Mm.
And physicians will say, I would love to use it, but I can't because.
Yeah, and I think Tom, you've been directly involved, haven't you, with us on early phase research around payer and physician. So totally agree. Tom, you've come off mute. Anything you want to add?
So I was going to touch on, I think, the theme you were adding. Let me just qualify first off. I respect the difficult decisions that senior leadership have to make on resource allocation, right? If you have an inline
Absolutely.
product that's generating revenue and I've got finite resources, that dollar spent against driving that product. I mean, we all, I know, respect that decision, but I must say we can talk about earlier in spending, but it is a really difficult challenge, and I respect the decisions that kind of have to be made there. I might make the argument that commercial needs to be involved all the way to phase one. The question in my mind might be the amount of resources that's needed to do that. So I think about the transition from preclinical to phase one. Now it's investor discussions. You got to be thinking about value. You got to be thinking about preliminary forecasts. I'm in discussion with someone on this very topic right now. Hey, we're going to move it to phase one. We're going to have to start communicating to investors. We need to start thinking about that. Now, that might be done by someone like the chief commercial officer, right? If they have one, that's a CEO. That's not a product manager role. That's
Right.
someone very, very early on. But by phase two, I would think you're thinking brand director. You're thinking about long-term projects that, Mike, you touched on naming. The payer work. I always think big opportunity after phase two to really get a payer assessment that can refine phase three. And I think that step is missed a lot. The other big one to me is life cycle management. That thinking really early on, those are huge lead times that are required to develop those kinds of strategies and
Absolutely.
plans. So by that point, you're kind of thinking director, and then maybe it is that T minus 24 where now you're building out launch plans, and now you got to start thinking about down to the product management level. So my kind of general point is, I think commercial needs to be involved somehow by someone all the way to that transition from preclinical to phase one, but it's the level of resource support that you put behind it that might, I think a little bit about it. So anyhow, just some comments.
No, totally agree.
Totally agree. Anybody else? Questions? Sanjay, I see you're off mute. Dave looks like he's just come on. Anybody else want to offer some questions?
No, Mike, actually, this is Sanjay. I worked in commercial at GSK for a long time and then at Biopharma. And Mike said the right things. Clearly, you need commercial involvement right from, say, post preclinical before it gets to phase one, as you decide, which indication to go and how to prioritize those indication based on the opportunity with TPP, and then all the way to life cycle management after phase three, phase four, too. Clearly, there is increasing pushback with the budget, and I've seen this all
Absolutely.
along with GSK as well as the small biotech. When money comes down to whether should I have a clinical trial funding or should I have somebody pay for commercial who I don't know whether I need it for another 2 years. And that's where the challenge comes in. One question and maybe a point that we need to consider is that how much of some of these AI related activities that if I can ask ChatGPT or another question that, okay, this is the comparative, I'm going into say breast cancer space and my product is going to be in third line. I want to see, what my TPP should be. If the current environment is such that they can get by very high level input at AI, how much of that commercial input, which is critical as we all know, is necessary, and how much of that is going to be a problem for either Phraktion or some of the small biotech companies to recruit commercial people.
Paul, I'll let you jump in, but I mean, my
Yeah.
initial thought is, and it's consistent with everything I know about AI right now, is that no one's certain how accurate AI is on a lot of topics. So, is a senior leader like Tom had mentioned going to be comfortable if somebody runs some AI that says, "Do this," and you'll achieve this kind of status within a therapeutic area? I'm not. I personally am not that
No,
comfortable.
it's a great. Yeah, you've got it spot on, Mike. We've spoken to a couple of members who are playing in the AI area at this very early phase. I would say it's really valuable for a rough cut first assessment. So, for example, one of the AI guys could do patient journeys. You've said it's important. They can scrape the web and they can get you a rough cut patient journey. However, what it will do is it'll emphasize gaps and missing pieces, which then needs to be interviewed in. You need to do qual and depth just to sort of substantiate. We worked with another agency that does payer and pricing work. Pharma doesn't leave its prices in public, doesn't leave its contracting in public. So therefore, you'll get close to an answer, but you won't get a convincing answer. You're going to have to talk to payers. So I think AI will get you some way, and then you need the depth of expertise to fill in the little details and the blanks, which are going to be critical when you're making that big multi-billion-dollar decision to go ahead. You imagine if you haven't quite got your price point right, you haven't got your Medicare, you haven't got your, pharmacy benefit contracting sorted out in the US, and you've made some assumptions on AI, I think you're going to be getting to hot water. So AI gets you somewhere. I think you still need some old grey-haired consultants to finish the game off. Dave, I know you want to jump in.
Well, no.
Yeah, I'll add to that because I think you did touch on, the need to do some market research in addition to the AI. I mean, AI is a good place to start to get kind of a framework for, the patient journey or what have you. But being in market research myself, I'd be an advocate for, I think it's a cost-effective way to evaluate pipeline products and, make some decisions about how much to invest, right? And so I think it all starts with really the patient and is how much unmet need is there? Because I think a lot of I think you'll agree with me. A lot of what we see in pharma development is opportunistic, right? They've got this molecule and they're trying to maximize the value, and it's kind of like finding new indications regardless of how strong the unmet need is or not. That happens a lot, and that's inevitable to a certain degree. But I think really, when you think about it, it should all start with the patient and where are their greatest needs. And so I guess one of my questions is, for discussion here is, at what point is actual patient research, whether that be surveys or qualitative research, is the best time to really dig in? I mean, I can answer that question myself because I think probably like phase 2 would be that spot,
Yeah.
but I just open that up for discussion.
We're doing it now. I mean, Fraction's in the middle of doing some phase 2. We've just done 35 interviews with a mix of payers, gastros, a whole variety of specialists. The answer, Dave, is that we can do it a lot leaner, simpler, more efficient. If you think about the usual players, Kantar, IQVIA, they will always suggest a large quant study, 500 physicians, $500,000, and they will come up with a binary yes/no, which actually is not the right answer at phase 2. With us involved, we can do, and Tom's done this. He did a road tour in America talking to psychedelic specialists. You can get to the answer with a lot less interviews and get to something reliable that you can bet your dollars on. You're going to have to repeat it maybe later and do quant, but I think we can do things much quicker, deeper, faster, earlier in phase 2 that will get you a good answer. Better than AI as well, although we are using AI to consolidate the research results because it's bloody quick.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Paul. And, you mentioned the research involving HCPs and payers, but in terms of actual just focusing on patient research,
no, I agree.
Are you seeing much of that too, or?
Yeah, I did
in that phase.
Ethnography in phase 2, because again, you're smoking out unmet need. You're actually understanding human behavior. And especially if you're doing patient journey work, you want to understand why a patient turns left and right in the diagnostic pathway, in the prescription pathway, and in the compliance pathway. Because very often you'll see a patient jumping off drug, even though you've had a bright idea. You're only going to get that through human behavior and patient interaction. So I'm convinced you've got to do it early. It's expensive-ish, although we can do it a lot cheaper, Dave. But ultimately, it's vital.
But also, if it's critical to get some patient data in a label,
yes,
if you wait later than phase 2, it's too late.
Yeah.
You're not going to have it. So, Dave, I agree that phase 2 is a good time to be doing that.
And we've got a live example in the fact Sean and Michelle, who work for the Patient Project, with the 2 members, have just finished a project with a US biotech where they did a patient engagement advisory board in the EU, mirrored from the US one, to make sure that phase 3 endpoints contained patient-friendly protocol design elements. So yes, totally. We've got a live case that actually we're writing up at the moment that completely underpins what you say, Dave, and what you just said, Mike.
Yeah, because I would personally like to, that's kind of a lot of what we do. We do mostly survey work with rare disease patients, but I'd like to kind of, do more in that stage of development, right? Because I tend to get more on the, commercial side when it's, either like pre-launch or already launched and marketed, right? So, great points.
No more questions in the chat, I don't think, Nigel. There's some comments.
Yeah, so just conscious of time, almost top of the hour. So I don't know if anybody has any final pertinent questions. Otherwise, I'm sure Mike will make himself available.
Absolutely.
The group afterwards. And as always, there'll be a video or recording of this posted very, very soon, the next couple of days. So please feel free to have a look at that and share with friends and colleagues, of course. But just to finish up then, thank you, Mike. I think you've set out the case very well to think about commercial involvement really early on in the development cycle. And, there's a mixture of prioritization across, both large and small companies. But how do you make that realistic in the real world? And maybe just a more fractional approach, actually bringing the expertise as and when you need it. The expertise you need is the way to achieve that in a very resource constrained environment. That's not going to get any better, not this year, not next year. So Phraktion is what we need to be thinking about always, I think. So with that, actually on AI, we'll be back in a few weeks with an AI expert. So you'll see details of that. Thanks for joining, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. Really enjoyed it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
for the
really good
opportunity.
talk. Thank you.
Thank you.